The telephone call came through at 3:47 in the morning, on January 12, 1944. Adolf Hitler stood in his nightclothes in the communications room of the Wolf's Lair, his East Prussian headquarters, listening to a voice he hadn't expected to hear at this hour. On the other end of the line, Luftwaffe Squadron Commander Hans-Joachim Hermann spoke with something Hitler had rarely heard from his pilots in 4 years of war. Genuine confusion mixed with what sounded uncomfortably like respect for the enemy. "Mein Führer," Hermann began, each word carefully measured, weighted with the knowledge that what he was about to report would not be well received. "The Americans have deployed a new fighter group to the Mediterranean theater. They fly red-tailed P-51 Mustangs. They operate with tactical discipline we haven't observed in other American units. They maintain tight formation. They do not break pursuit for individual glory kills. They do not abandon their bombers." Hitler gripped the telephone receiver tighter, his knuckles whitening. "I didn't wake you to describe American fighter tactics, Commander. Get to the point." Hermann's pause stretched like a torture session. In that silence, Hitler could hear what the commander was reluctant to say. "Mein Führer, in 6 operational months, this particular fighter group has completed 68 bomber escort missions. Our fighter wings have engaged them repeatedly. We have studied their patterns. We have analyzed their performance. And they have not lost a single bomber under their direct protection. Not one, mein Führer. Not in 68 missions." The telephone receiver trembled slightly in Hitler's hand. Impossible. Statistically impossible. His Luftwaffe had been bleeding American bomber formations for 2 years. The mathematics of aerial warfare fundamentally favored the defender. Every bombing raid over the Reich should hemorrhage B-17s like a slaughtered animal. Heavy bombers were slow, ungainly targets. German fighters were fast, well-armed, and flown by experienced pilots who knew every tactical advantage. A bomber escort mission where a few bombers got through was considered successful by American standards. A mission where half the bombers survived was celebrated. But 0 losses. Across 68 separate engagements? That defied every principle of aerial combat, every tactical assumption, every strategic calculation that had governed air warfare since 1939. "How is this possible?" Hitler demanded. "Are these pilots flying defensive patterns we haven't encountered? Do they have superior aircraft? Are they avoiding combat?" "None of those explanations fit the evidence," Hermann replied carefully. "Their aircraft are standard P-51D Mustangs, identical to those flown by other American fighter groups. Their tactical patterns are aggressive, not defensive. They engage our fighters directly whenever we approach the bomber formations. They accumulate victories at rates comparable to or exceeding other American units, but they never, mein Führer, abandon their primary mission of bomber protection to pursue individual kills." Hitler's mind raced through possibilities. Better training. The Americans had been refining their fighter tactics for months. Superior coordination? Perhaps they had developed new radio protocols or formation techniques. Numerical advantage? No. Intelligence reports showed this particular group flew with the same aircraft numbers as other escort units. "There must be something that distinguishes this unit," Hitler said. "Find out what makes them different. I want a complete intelligence assessment within 48 hours. Names of commanders, training background, operational doctrine, everything." "Jawohl, mein Führer." Hermann hesitated again. That pause. Hitler had learned to recognize it over years of military briefings. It meant the officer had additional information he was reluctant to share, information that would be politically or ideologically uncomfortable. "What else?" Hitler snapped. "Reconnaissance photography from high-altitude flights over their Italian air bases shows unusual characteristics regarding the pilots, mein Führer." "Speak plainly, Commander." "The pilots of the 302nd Fighter Group appear to be Negroes, mein Führer. Black Americans. Our photo analysts have confirmed this across multiple reconnaissance flights. The Americans have deployed colored pilots to fight over Europe." The telephone line fell silent. Hitler stood perfectly still in the communications room, his brain refusing for several seconds to process what he had just heard. Black pilots, achieving the most exceptional bomber protection record in the entire European theater. Men his racial ideology classified as inferior. Men his propaganda machine insisted were intellectually incapable of complex tasks. Men who, according to Nazi racial science, shouldn't be able to perform sophisticated military operations. And these men were systematically destroying the Luftwaffe's tactical effectiveness, making German fighter pilots look incompetent, protecting American bomber formations with a success rate that approached statistical impossibility. "You're certain of this identification?" Hitler asked quietly. "Completely certain, mein Führer. We have photographs showing the pilots at their Italian bases. Even from high altitude, their racial characteristics are unmistakable. Additionally, we've intercepted American communications that reference Tuskegee pilots, which our intelligence services have identified as referring to a Negro aviation training program in Alabama." Hitler slowly hung up the telephone, stood in the darkened communications room. His entire worldview, the foundation upon which he had built the Third Reich, the justification for every policy, every war, every atrocity, rested on the principle of Aryan superiority and racial hierarchy, and reality had just staged an armed rebellion against that worldview. In the clear skies over Germany and occupied Europe, where everyone could see, Black American pilots were proving through undeniable demonstration that his fundamental beliefs were fiction. What Hitler didn't yet understand, standing in his nightclothes at 3:47 in the morning, was that this revelation would consume him for the remaining months of the war, would drive him to decisions that made no military sense, would push him into territory where ideology trumped strategy, where racial obsession overrode tactical necessity. The Tuskegee Airmen had just become the most dangerous threat to Nazi Germany, not because of what they did militarily, but because of what they represented philosophically. They were living proof that everything Hitler promised was a lie. If you're finding this story as compelling as we are, hit that subscribe button and smash that like. This gets deeper and darker than you can imagine, and you won't want to miss what happens next. 300 miles south of Berlin, Hauptmann Franz Stigler squinted through his Messerschmitt Bf 109's cockpit canopy at the bomber formation, approaching through scattered clouds at 26,000 feet. Stigler was a veteran of 487 combat missions, North Africa, Sicily, Italy, now defense of the Reich. He could identify aircraft types from silhouettes alone at distances where most pilots saw only indistinct shapes. These were B-17 flying fortresses, the American heavy bombers that had been systematically reducing German industrial capacity to rubble for 18 months. 24 aircraft in tight box formation, probably targeting Munich's railway yards or the Messerschmitt production facilities. But what caught Stigler's attention wasn't the bombers themselves, it was their escorts. Sleek P-51 Mustangs in standard olive drab, except for one absolutely distinctive feature that made identification instant even from 5 miles away. Bright red tail assemblies that gleamed like fresh blood against the winter sky, crimson tails that had become legendary among Luftwaffe pilots in recent months, discussed in ready rooms with a mixture of professional respect and growing unease. The Red Tails, the 302nd Fighter Group, the unit that didn't fight like other Americans. Stigler had encountered these particular escorts twice before. Both times his Jagdgeschwader had suffered losses that exceeded normal engagement parameters. These American pilots flew with discipline that seemed almost un-American, maintaining defensive formations instead of breaking off to dogfight like glory-hungry individualists. German intelligence had analyzed their tactics extensively. Standard American fighter doctrine emphasized aggressive pursuit, individual initiative, and accumulating personal victory scores. Fighter pilots were encouraged to break formation to chase German interceptors, to prioritize kills over mission objectives, to think like hunters rather than shepherds. But the Red Tails flew differently. They positioned themselves in layered defensive shells around the bomber formations. They maintained station, even when German fighters baited them with vulnerable targets. They coordinated their movements with precision that suggested extensive training and iron discipline. When they did engage, they did it with calculated efficiency rather than emotional aggression. It was like watching chess pieces move across a three-dimensional board. each Mustang pilot anticipating German attack vectors, 3 moves ahead, and systematically closing every tactical gap before the opportunity could be exploited. Stigler armed his cannons and began his attack approach, climbing to 28,000 feet to gain altitude advantage. His wingman, Lieutenant Werner Backe, formed up on his right. They would dive from above with the sun at their backs, targeting the trailing bomber element, where a B-17 had dropped slightly below formation, with its No. 3 engine trailing dark smoke and oil vapor. Easy prey. A straggler separated from the protection of the herd. Stigler had killed dozens of bombers exactly this way over the past year. He pushed his throttle forward, rolling into his diving attack. The red-tailed Mustangs should be blind to him for another 8 seconds. 7, 6, 5. A tracer round cracked past his canopy at the 5-second mark. Impossible. The angle was completely wrong. The geometry didn't work unless... Stigler craned his neck and looked up. A lone Mustang with crimson tail surfaces hung inverted 3,000 feet above the bomber formation, its pilot having anticipated the exact attack vector, predicted Stigler's approach angle, positioned himself perfectly before Stigler had even committed to the dive. The American had been waiting, watching, calculating. He'd read Stigler's intentions like a grandmaster reading chess moves. Stigler broke off his attack, hauling his Bf-109 into a punishing 8G turn that grayed his vision. His heart hammered against his ribs. In 23 months of combat flying, in 487 missions across 3 theaters of war, he had never encountered pilots who thought this far ahead, who anticipated attacks before they developed, who operated with this level of tactical precognition. These weren't the reckless American cowboys that propaganda broadcasts described. These weren't the undisciplined individualists that Luftwaffe briefings promised. These were technicians, surgeons of aerial combat, who had studied every German tactic and developed countermeasures that bordered on supernatural. Stigler and Backe reformed and attempted 2 more attack runs. Both times, the red tails repositioned with mathematical precision to block every approach vector. By the time German fighters maneuvered into firing position, the geometry had already changed. The Americans moved like water, flowing into gaps before the gaps could be exploited. The bomber formation continued toward Munich, without losing a single aircraft. Back at his airfield near Augsburg, Stigler filed his mission report with unusual detail. He wasn't just recording a failed interception, he was documenting something that troubled him on a fundamental level. The red-tailed fighter group demonstrates combat effectiveness approximately 40% higher than standard American fighter units, he wrote. Their bomber protection rate approaches statistical impossibility. Their tactical discipline exceeds anything observed from American or British pilots. Either the Americans have developed revolutionary new tactical doctrine, or they have recruited pilots with fundamentally different training methodology and psychological profiles. What Stigler did not include in his formal report, what he couldn't quite articulate even to himself during conversations with other pilots in the officers' mess, was the deeper implication that gnawed at him. If these black American pilots men the Reich classified as racially inferior men, German propaganda insisted were intellectually limited. If these men were outperforming the Luftwaffe's best pilots by measurable margins, then everything the Reich promised about Aryan supremacy was demonstrable fiction. The cognitive dissonance was too massive to confront directly, so Stigler focused on technical details, on tactical analysis, on any explanation that didn't require examining the foundations of his worldview. He left the philosophical crater unexplored, because looking into it meant confronting uncomfortable truths about the ideology he'd spent 4 years fighting to defend. His report landed on a desk at Luftwaffe High Command in Berlin 36 hours later. An intelligence analyst highlighted 3 sentences in red pencil and forwarded the document up the chain of command with a note. 17th similar report received this month regarding exceptional performance from American 332nd Fighter Group. Pattern requires senior attention. Within a week, Stigler's report crossed Hitler's desk alongside those 17 similar reports from different Luftwaffe units across Germany, Austria, and occupied France, all describing the same phenomenon: all documenting the same tactical excellence, all struggling to explain how one American fighter group achieved protection rates that exceeded every historical precedent. The Führer read each report twice, his face darkening with each page, his jaw clenching tighter. Reality was staging an armed rebellion against his entire worldview, and the mutiny was happening in clear skies over Germany where everyone, German pilots, ground crews, civilians watching contrails, could witness it. Something would have to be done. The question was what, and how far Hitler was willing to go to suppress evidence that undermined the ideological foundations of the Nazi state. Hitler summoned Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring to the Wolf's Lair on February 12, 1944. Göring arrived expecting another tirade about Luftwaffe failures, the usual threats and recriminations that had become routine as Allied air superiority increased. Instead, he found the Führer uncharacteristically quiet, studying reconnaissance photographs spread across his map table like a medical examiner reviewing autopsy images. "Explain these," Hitler said without preamble, tapping a photograph showing 3 red-tailed Mustangs escorting a damaged B-17 through a gap in clouds. The bomber trailed smoke from 2 engines, but the fighters maintained tight protective formation. "Explain to me how the Americans achieve 0 bomber losses with these particular escorts, when our fighters shoot down 20 to 30 bombers per raid with other groups." Göring shifted his considerable weight from foot to foot. The Reichsmarschall had gained 70 pounds since 1940, his uniform straining at the buttons, his multiple chins cascading over his collar. He looked like a parody of military leadership. "Mein Führer, American fighter tactics have improved across all units in recent months. They have numerical superiority now, better range with external drop tanks, more aggressive escort protocols." "Don't insult my intelligence with generalities," Hitler interrupted, his voice dropping to the quiet register that preceded his legendary explosions. "I have 17 field reports here documenting exceptional performance from one specific unit, the 332nd Fighter Group. Do you know what makes this unit different from every other American fighter group operating over Europe, Reichsmarschall?" Göring's silence answered for him. Hitler slid another photograph across the table. This one captured by a German reconnaissance aircraft flying at extreme altitude over an American airbase in southern Italy. It showed pilots climbing from their Mustangs after a mission, gathering for debriefing. Even in grainy black and white, even from several thousand feet altitude, the pilot's skin color was unmistakable. "The Americans sent Negroes to fight their war," Hitler said, the word dripping with venom and disbelief. "And these Negroes are beating our best pilots. Systematically, repeatedly, measuring their success in 0 bomber losses across 68 missions. Do you understand what this means? Do you grasp the propaganda disaster if this becomes widely known?" Göring understood perfectly. Nazi racial theory had constructed an elaborate hierarchy with Aryans at the apex, Slavs in the middle, and Africans near the bottom. The entire justification for German expansion, for occupation policies, for the concentration camps, for everything. All of it rested on the premise of inherent Aryan superiority. If black pilots were outperforming German aces, the entire ideological structure collapsed like a building with rotten foundations. Soviet propaganda would feast on this information for years. American morale would skyrocket. Worse, it would raise questions among German citizens who were already exhausted by years of war, constant bombing, food shortages, and broken promises about imminent victory. "What do you suggest, mein Führer?" Göring asked carefully. Hitler turned away from the photographs, staring through the reinforced windows at the East Prussian forest beyond. Snow covered everything in white that looked deceptively peaceful. "First, complete information suppression. Effective immediately. Any Luftwaffe pilot who encounters the red-tailed fighters receives explicit orders. No discussion of the American pilot's race in official reports, mess halls, or letters home. Anyone who violates this directive faces immediate court-martial for undermining military morale and spreading defeatist propaganda." Göring nodded slowly. Information control was standard practice. The propaganda ministry did it constantly. "And second," Hitler continued, his voice hardening into something that made Goering's stomach clench. "You will personally develop a tactical response that eliminates this unit. I don't care about resources required. I don't care about redeploying squadrons from other fronts. I want the 332nd Fighter Group destroyed, completely and publicly, in a manner that demonstrates Luftwaffe superiority beyond any question." Goering swallowed hard. Destroying one specific fighter group required concentrating overwhelming force at known intercept points, which meant pulling fighter assets from defensive positions, protecting German cities from daily bombing raids. It meant accepting higher American bomber losses everywhere else to achieve a propaganda victory against one symbolic unit. The military logic was completely absurd. But Goering had learned not to argue with Hitler's obsessions, especially when those obsessions touched on racial ideology. "I'll develop operational options immediately, mein Führer," Goering promised. "You'll do more than that," Hitler continued, still staring out the window. "You'll also initiate a parallel intelligence operation. I want to know everything about these pilots, how they were selected, how they were trained, what makes them effective, their psychological profiles, their tactical weaknesses, anything exploitable. If we can't defeat them through conventional means, we'll find other methods, unconventional methods." The meeting concluded with Goering departing to implement orders that made no strategic sense, but perfect ideological sense to a dictator watching his worldview crumble in real time. Hitler remained at his map table, studying the photographs of red-tailed Mustangs with an intensity that bordered on obsession. For a man who had built his entire political movement on theories of racial hierarchy, these pilots represented something more dangerous than military opposition. They represented proof that his fundamental assumptions were wrong, that the racial science he'd promoted was pseudoscience, that the hierarchy he'd used to justify atrocities was fiction invented to rationalize prejudice. In the days following that meeting, Hitler's inner circle noticed a disturbing shift in his behavior. He became fixated on aerial combat reports, demanding updates on every engagement involving the 332nd. When advisors suggested focusing on more pressing strategic concerns, the advancing Soviets, the invasion threat in France, collapsing industrial production, Hitler would redirect conversations back to the red-tailed fighters. It was Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, who recognized the deeper psychology at work. Goebbels understood that Hitler's ideology required constant validation through real-world events. Every German military victory served as evidence of Aryan superiority. Every technological advancement proved the master race's intellectual dominance. Every conquest demonstrated the natural order asserting itself. But these black American pilots disrupted the narrative in a way that couldn't be explained away or ignored. They weren't losing. They weren't failing. They weren't confirming the racial stereotypes. Instead, they were excelling beyond the performance of white American pilots, humiliating German aces, and doing it all in a way that was documented, verified, and impossible to deny. Goebbels approached the problem with characteristic cynicism. If the pilots couldn't be defeated militarily, they would be defeated narratively. He ordered his ministry to develop alternative explanations for the 332nd's success. Perhaps they flew newer aircraft with superior technology. Perhaps they received easier mission assignments with less fighter opposition. Perhaps they were actually white pilots misidentified by German reconnaissance. Perhaps their success was exaggerated American propaganda. The truth was irrelevant to Goebbels. Only the story mattered. Only the narrative that protected Nazi racial ideology from confronting uncomfortable facts. Meanwhile, Goering assembled his tactical planning staff at Luftwaffe High Command. The objective was clear: engineer a massive aerial engagement that would result in catastrophic losses for the 392nd Fighter Group. The Luftwaffe would sacrifice tactical advantages elsewhere to concentrate overwhelming force at a single point where the Red Tails could be isolated, outnumbered, and annihilated. But planning such an operation proved more complex than anticipated. The 332nd didn't operate independently. They were integrated into larger American bomber streams, protected by multiple fighter groups. Isolating them required predicting their assignment schedule, which was classified information that changed daily based on target priorities and operational requirements. It meant penetrating American operational security, getting extraordinarily lucky, or both. Göring's staff began monitoring radio traffic, analyzing mission patterns, attempting to decrypt American military communications. They built statistical models predicting which bomber formations the 332nd would escort, based on target profiles and previous assignments. It was intelligence work on a scale normally reserved for major strategic operations, all focused on destroying one fighter group for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with military necessity and everything to do with protecting an ideology from inconvenient facts. Captain Robert Wilson felt the G-forces compress his spine as he rolled his P-51 Mustang inverted at 24,000 feet, hanging from his harness straps while scanning the sky below for German fighters. The bomber formation he was protecting, 18 B-17s bound for Stuttgart, droned on steadily, their contrails drawing white lines across the February sky like chalk on a blue slate. Wilson's radio crackled with tension. Bandits, 9 o'clock high, 12 plus. He spotted them immediately. Formation of Focke-Wulf FW-190s diving from 30,000 feet, sun at their backs, approaching at a calculated 60-degree angle designed to slice through the bomber formation before American escorts could respond. Standard Luftwaffe tactics, executed thousands of times over the past year. But something felt different about this attack. The German fighters dove with unusual precision, their formation tighter than normal, suggesting experienced pilots rather than the half-trained replacements the Luftwaffe had been fielding lately. "Red flight, extend left," Wilson ordered, his voice calm despite adrenaline flooding his system. "Blue flight, maintain high cover." His squadron had practiced this defensive pattern so many times it had become muscle memory. The key principle: never pursue individual targets. Never break formation to chase glory. Stay with the bombers. Make the Germans come through you. The Focke-Wulfs committed to their dive, speed building toward 400 miles per hour. Wilson waited, counting seconds in his head, calculating intercept geometry with the automatic precision of someone who'd done this 87 times before. At exactly the right moment, he led red flight into a climbing turn that put 4 Mustangs directly between the German fighters and the lead bomber element. The fight devolved into whirling chaos. Tracer fire drew neon lines across the sky. Aircraft pulled crushing G-forces through evasive maneuvers. Wilson fired a 3-second burst at a Focke-Wulf passing perpendicular to his flight path. Saw his rounds walking across the German's wing route. The enemy fighter pulled up hard, trailing smoke, then rolled into a spiral dive that took it out of the immediate combat area. But something felt wrong. The German fighters weren't breaking off after their initial pass like they usually did when faced with determined resistance. They were reforming, circling back, committing to a sustained engagement. Wilson's tactical instincts, honed through 87 combat missions, screamed warnings. This wasn't a standard raid interception. This was something else. "Talbert, you got eyes on second wave?" Wilson called to his wingman. "Negative, lead. Skies clear to the... Wait. Bandits, 12 o'clock level, range 4 miles. Jesus Christ, there's got to be 30 of them." Wilson's stomach dropped like a stone. The first group had been a diversion, forcing his fighters to expend ammunition and energy, while a much larger German force maneuvered into position. He'd been suckered into exactly the kind of engagement he'd spent 2 years avoiding. The second wave consisted of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s in mixed formation. A coordinated assault that suggested careful planning rather than opportunistic interception. Wilson made a split-second calculation. If he maintained defensive position over the bombers, the Germans would simply overwhelm through numerical superiority, 30 fighters against his squadron of 16. But if he took the fight to them, aggressive pursuit that violated his squadron's core doctrine, he might disrupt their formation before they reached the B-17s. "All flights, prepare to engage offensive," Wilson ordered, the words feeling alien in his mouth. "We're going to break their formation before they reach the package." He pushed his throttle to maximum power, and dove toward the approaching German fighters, his squadron following in tight formation behind him. The closure rate was insane. Two opposing forces rushing toward each other at combined speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. In seconds, the neat tactical picture dissolved into a swirling dogfight, where friend and foe occupied the same cubic mile of sky. Wilson found himself on the tail of a Bf-109, firing controlled bursts while the German pilot threw his aircraft through violent evasive maneuvers that would have torn the wings off lesser aircraft. His guns registered hits along the fuselage and left wing. The Bf-109 snap-rolled right and dove. Wilson followed, his airspeed building toward the red line as he chased the German down through 15,000 feet. Then he heard the voice he'd been dreading, the radio call that meant his tactical gamble had failed. "Bombers under attack. Southwest element taking fire. 2 bombers hit. 1 going down." Wilson abandoned his pursuit, yanked his Mustang into a punishing 8G turn back toward the bomber formation. His vision grayed at the edges from sustained G-forces, but he forced the stick harder anyway, trading precious altitude for speed in a desperate climb back to 20,000 feet. The scene that greeted him was every escort pilot's nightmare. German fighters swarmed through the bomber formation like wolves among sheep. 2 B-17s trailed fire and smoke. One was already in a death spiral with crew members tumbling from emergency exits, parachutes blossoming white against the dark earth 20,000 feet below. The remaining bombers had tightened formation, their defensive machine gun fire creating cones of tracer rounds and spent shells. But the Luftwaffe pilots pressed their attacks with suicidal determination that Wilson had never witnessed before. He dove back into the fight, but he was out of position, critically low on ammunition, and facing an enemy that had planned this engagement with meticulous care, specifically designed to defeat his tactics. For the first time in his entire combat career, Captain Robert Wilson felt genuinely outmaneuvered. The Germans had studied his squadron's defensive philosophy, identified the one weakness in their doctrine, the inability to be in multiple places simultaneously, and engineered a scenario that exploited that weakness perfectly. The debriefing after the Stuttgart mission lasted 3 brutal hours. Wilson sat in a canvas chair in the operations tent, while intelligence officers peppered him with questions about German attack patterns, force composition, and tactical innovations he'd observed. 2 bombers lost, 7 damaged badly enough to require extensive repairs, 9 crew members killed, 14 wounded. The worst losses Wilson's squadron had experienced in 6 months of escort operations. "They knew," Wilson said quietly, studying his hands like they belonged to someone else. "This wasn't a random interception or opportunistic attack. They planned this engagement specifically to defeat our defensive tactics. They knew exactly how we'd respond to each wave." The intelligence officer, a major from Philadelphia who'd never flown combat, looked skeptical. "You're suggesting the Luftwaffe designed an operation to target your squadron specifically? That seems paranoid, Captain." "I'm not suggesting anything," Wilson replied, meeting the major's eyes. "I'm telling you what happened at 24,000 feet. 3 waves of fighters, each one positioned to exploit our response to the previous wave. They accepted casualties in the first 2 groups to create tactical openings for the third. That's not standard German doctrine. That's mission-specific planning. To what end? Shooting down 2 bombers hardly justifies the resources you're describing." Wilson's jaw clenched. It wasn't about the bombers. It was about us, about proving they could beat the Tuskegee pilots, about demonstrating that we're not actually as good as our record suggests. The tent fell into uncomfortable silence. Everyone understood what Wilson wasn't saying directly, that the 302nd Fighter Group's race made them targets beyond normal military considerations, that the Luftwaffe wasn't just fighting American pilots, they were fighting the symbolic threat those pilots represented to Nazi ideology. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the 302nd's commanding officer, arrived at the debriefing midway through. He listened to Wilson's account without interruption, his expression revealing nothing of what he was thinking. When Wilson finished, Davis dismissed the intelligence officer and closed the tent flap for privacy. How many missions have you flown, Captain? Davis asked. 87, sir. And in those 87 missions, how many times have you encountered tactical planning this sophisticated? Never, sir. The Luftwaffe has excellent pilots, but their command structure is fragmented. They don't usually coordinate complex operations across multiple fighter groups like this. Davis nodded slowly. He pulled a folder from his briefcase and extracted several reconnaissance photographs. I received a classified briefing last week from Theater Intelligence. They're monitoring German radio traffic for references to our unit. In the past month, mentions have increased by 300%. The Germans are talking about us constantly, our tactics, our performance record, our distinctive characteristics. Wilson understood immediately. They're obsessed. Worse than obsessed, Davis corrected. They're ideologically threatened, and desperate men make dangerous choices. Davis pulled out more photographs. These ones showed fighter aircraft concentrations at German airfields, far exceeding normal defensive deployments. Intelligence estimates they've pulled fighters from 3 different defensive sectors and concentrated them near probable American bomber routes. They are sacrificing protection over their own cities to mass forces in specific areas where they expect to encounter us. The implications were staggering. The Luftwaffe was so fixated on destroying the 332nd that they were accepting strategic vulnerability elsewhere. Hitler's Air Force was making operationally unsound decisions driven by ideological imperatives rather than military logic. "What do we do, sir?" Wilson asked. Davis was quiet for a long moment. "We adapt. The defensive tactics that served us well for 6 months are now a liability because the Germans have solved that puzzle. So we give them a different puzzle to solve." Over the following week, Davis completely redesigned the 332nd's tactical doctrine. Instead of pure defensive escort, they would operate in layered formations with some flights maintaining tight bomber protection, while others positioned themselves to counter German responses to the defensive elements. It was chess played in 3 dimensions at 300 miles per hour, requiring trust and communication that exceeded anything demanded of pilots in other fighter groups. Wilson spent hours with his flight leaders rehearsing the new patterns over the Italian countryside. The pilots understood what was at stake. They were fighting 2 wars simultaneously: the military conflict against Germany and the ideological conflict against everyone who believed black men couldn't excel as combat aviators. "My brother wrote me last week," Lieutenant Charles Bailey mentioned during a training break. "He's still in Alabama working at the Tuskegee base as a mechanic. Says he follows our mission reports like baseball scores. Says people back home are watching everything we do." "No pressure," another pilot joked. But the humor fell flat. They all felt the weight of representation, the knowledge that their performance would be generalized across an entire race by people looking for reasons to confirm their prejudices. Every mission was being watched, every success celebrated, every failure scrutinized. The night before the next major mission, Wilson lay in his bunk listening to distant artillery fire from the Italian front line. He thought about the German pilots who would try to kill him tomorrow, wondered if any of them questioned the ideology that made this fight personal rather than purely military. Probably not. People rarely examined the foundations of their worldview, especially when those foundations justified their position in the social hierarchy. He also thought about Hitler sitting in his bunker somewhere in Germany, obsessing over reconnaissance photographs of red-tailed Mustangs. Hitler had built an empire on the promise of Aryan supremacy, and now that empire was crumbling, while black pilots protected American bombers with unprecedented effectiveness. The cognitive dissonance must be excruciating. Good. Let it hurt. Let every successful mission gnaw at Hitler's certainty. Let the gap between Nazi theory and observable reality grow until it swallowed the entire rotten ideology whole. Wilson closed his eyes and forced himself towards sleep. Tomorrow would bring another battle. But tomorrow, the 332nd would fly new tactical patterns designed to counter German adaptations. They would demonstrate the same flexibility and innovation that had made them the most effective escort group in the Mediterranean theater. And somewhere in Germany, Someone would file another report that contradicted everything the Nazis promised about racial hierarchy. The cumulative weight of those contradictions might not end the war by themselves, but they would contribute to demolishing the lies that had started it. The Führer's rage manifested as cold silence rather than the expected explosive tantrum. Goering stood at attention in the Wolf's Lair briefing room, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the February chill seeping through the concrete walls. He watched Hitler study the Munich mission after-action reports with the methodical attention of a pathologist examining tissue samples for malignancy. "You concentrated 43 fighters from 3 separate Jagdgeschwader," Hitler said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You engineered an engagement specifically designed to overwhelm the 332nd through numerical superiority and tactical surprise." He looked up from the reports. "Remind me of the result, Reichsmarschall." Goering cleared his throat. His voice came out smaller than he intended. 4 German fighters lost, 7 damaged. American losses were 2 bombers, 1 Mustang. The red-tailed pilots adapted to our 3-wave attack pattern within minutes and established a defensive configuration our pilots had not encountered previously. They adapted. Hitler set down the reports with precise, controlled movements that were somehow more terrifying than thrown objects or screaming fits. They adapted to tactics we developed specifically to counter their previous methods. Do you understand what this indicates about their training, their tactical flexibility, their command structure? Mein Führer, it indicates they are better than our pilots," Hitler interrupted quietly. Each word landed like a physical blow. "It indicates that Negroes, who according to our racial science should be intellectually inferior, who our propaganda describes as primitive, are demonstrating cognitive abilities and tactical innovation that surpass the performance of German aces. Do you grasp the implications, Reichsmarschall?" Goering said nothing. There was nothing he could say that wouldn't make the situation exponentially worse. Hitler stood and walked to the map wall showing Luftwaffe deployment across Europe. Red pins marked fighter concentrations. Blue pins showed American bomber routes. Green pins indicated the 392nd Fighter Group's known operating areas. Those green pins haunted Hitler's strategic vision like infections visible on an X-ray. "Goebbels wants to suppress all information about these pilots," Hitler continued, still facing the map. "He believes we can simply pretend they don't exist, that we can control the narrative through propaganda manipulation. But you can't propaganda your way out of observable reality, Reichsmarschall. Our pilots know. Their reports circulate. Soldiers talk in mess halls and write letters home. Every conversation where someone mentions the exceptional Black American fighter group is a conversation that undermines everything we've built. What do you propose, mein Führer?" Hitler turned from the map, and the expression on his face made Goering's blood run cold. It was the look Hitler got when he moved beyond conventional solutions into the realm of desperate measures that violated normal military ethics. The look that preceded orders nobody wanted to execute, but everyone would obey. "I propose we stop pretending this is a conventional military problem," Hitler said. "The 332nd Fighter Group is an ideological threat that requires an ideological response. You will coordinate with Himmler and the SS intelligence services. I want options that go beyond aerial combat, unconventional options." Ice formed in Goering's stomach. When Hitler invoked Himmler and SS intelligence in military matters, the discussion moved beyond honorable warfare into darker territory. Sabotage, assassination, psychological warfare operations that existed in moral gray zones no professional soldier wanted to enter. "You're suggesting unconventional operations against American pilots?" Goering asked carefully. "I'm suggesting we exploit every vulnerability," Hitler replied. "These pilots operate from Italian air bases. They rely on fuel supplies, maintenance infrastructure, ground support. They have predictable patterns, known locations. If we cannot defeat them in the air through conventional means, we defeat them through other methods. Any methods necessary." Goering understood the order without needing explicit details spelled out. Hitler wanted the 332nd Fighter Group destroyed through whatever means proved effective. sabotage of aircraft, attacks on ground facilities, perhaps even targeted operations against individual pilots. It was asymmetric warfare that Germany usually condemned when enemies employed it against German forces. Mein Führer. Targeting specific American units for special operations could invite retaliation against our own forces. The Americans will do nothing, Hitler interrupted, because they won't acknowledge what makes this unit special. They can't publicize the race of these pilots without highlighting their own military segregation and domestic racial policies. Both sides have incentive to maintain silence about the racial dynamics. That gives us freedom of action in a shadow war where normal rules don't apply. It was twisted logic, but not entirely wrong. The American military did maintain strict segregation. News coverage of the Tuskegee Airmen back in the United States was carefully controlled and limited. Both nations had powerful reasons to keep this particular story out of public discourse, which meant operations against the 382nd might be conducted in darkness where accountability didn't exist. Göring departed the meeting with orders to coordinate with SS Obergruppenführer Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of Reich Security Main Office. The prospect of involving Kaltenbrunner, a man whose operational specialty involved Gestapo torture techniques, in military operations made Göring physically nauseous. But Hitler had given explicit orders, and disobeying the Führer in February 1944 was tantamount to suicide. 3 days later, Göring found himself in a different briefing room with very different attendees. Kaltenbrunner sat across the table, his scarred face impassive, flanked by 2 SS intelligence officers who took notes with the mechanical precision of men documenting atrocities for bureaucratic records. The Führer has requested contingency operations against the American 332nd Fighter Group, Göring began, hating every word coming out of his mouth. Specifically, operations that exploit ground-based vulnerabilities rather than aerial engagement. Kaltenbrunner smiled, an expression completely devoid of warmth or humanity. I've already begun preliminary analysis. The unit operates from Ramitelli Airfield in southern Italy. Security there is standard American military protocol, competent but not exceptional. Italian partisan activity in the region provides cover for infiltration operations. We have assets in place. Finally, Davis stood and interrupted a theoretical discussion about Red Cross involvement. Gentlemen, while we debate diplomatic protocols, my pilots face an enemy trying to kill them both in the air and on the ground. I need concrete action, not political strategy sessions. Eaker nodded decisively. You're right, Colonel. Here's what happens immediately. First, I'm authorizing dedicated counterintelligence resources for your unit. Experienced OSS operatives who specialize in infiltration detection and partisan network disruption. Second, we establish a rapid response force of military police specifically assigned to Ramitelli security. Third, we rotate your unit's operational base periodically to prevent Germans from establishing surveillance patterns. What about retaliation for Lieutenant Harris? Davis asked directly. Officially, we can't acknowledge race-based targeting without political authorization from Washington. That won't come, Eaker replied. Unofficially. He glanced at the intelligence officers present. Efforts will be made to identify and neutralize the German intelligence networks operating in southern Italy. Some of those efforts might be considerably more aggressive than standard counterintelligence operations. Is that sufficient? Davis understood the subtext clearly. The American military would respond to German war crimes through covert operations that maintained plausible deniability. It wasn't justice, but it was something. Thank you, General. My pilots will continue their mission. I know they will, Eaker replied. And Colonel, for what it's worth, the performance of the 332nd has not gone unnoticed at the highest levels. General Eisenhower specifically mentioned your unit in recent briefings, praising your bomber protection statistics. There are conversations happening about integration, about changing policies after the war ends. What you and your pilots are accomplishing has impact beyond the immediate military situation. Davis nodded but felt no satisfaction. Change after the war wouldn't help Lieutenant Harris or the other pilots targeted by German obsession right now. They needed protection immediately, not promises about future policy reforms that might never materialize. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally, its armies defeated, its cities in ruins, its Führer dead by suicide in a Berlin bunker, while Soviet shells reduced the capital to rubble. The 1,000-year Reich Hitler had promised lasted exactly 12 years and left Europe in ashes. Captain Robert Wilson stood on the tarmac at Ramitelli on VE Day, watching mechanics paint final victory symbols on the red-tailed Mustangs that had carried them through 2 years of combat. The 332nd Fighter Group had completed 200 bomber escort missions. They had damaged or destroyed 409 German aircraft, and they had maintained the most exceptional bomber protection record of any escort group in the entire war, flying 179 missions, where not a single bomber under their direct protection was lost to enemy fighters. The statistics were undeniable. The record was verified by multiple sources and confirmed through exhaustive documentation that nobody could dispute. Black American pilots had not merely performed adequately. They had excelled beyond standards achieved by any comparable unit, white or black, American or Allied. But V-Day celebrations felt muted for Wilson and his fellow pilots. They'd won the war against Germany, but they were returning to an America where segregation remained legal, where Jim Crow laws denied them basic civil rights, where the same nation they'd fought to protect still refused them service at restaurants and hotels because of skin color. Colonel Davis gathered his pilots for a final briefing as the unit prepared to redeploy stateside. "What we accomplished here will echo for generations," Davis said, his voice carrying across the assembled pilots. "We proved something that racists claimed was impossible. We demonstrated excellence under circumstances specifically designed to ensure our failure. And we did it with honor, discipline, and courage that nobody can honestly dispute." "Will it matter?" Lieutenant Bailey asked quietly. "Will anything actually change back home because we shot down German planes over Europe?" Davis was silent for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know with certainty," he admitted. "Real change comes slowly, painfully. But we've given people who advocate for justice undeniable evidence. We've made it impossible for anyone to claim with a straight face that Black Americans can't perform at the highest levels, in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. That's not nothing. That's ammunition for battles that will be fought long after we're gone." Wilson thought about Lieutenant Harris, executed by German infiltrators for having the audacity to challenge Nazi racial theories by existing as an excellent pilot. Thought about the mechanics killed in sabotage attacks. Thought about pilots lost to war crimes that operated outside conventional combat. He thought about Hitler obsessing over reconnaissance photographs in his bunker, unable to reconcile observable reality with ideological certainty, unable to accept that his racial theories were fiction exposed by facts. The victory felt incomplete because the war had revealed truths many people still weren't ready to accept. Germany had built an empire on racial hierarchy and been utterly defeated by a coalition that included soldiers from dozens of ethnicities and backgrounds working together. The Tuskegee Airmen had demonstrated through undeniable performance that capability transcended racial categories completely. But acknowledging those truths required surrendering prejudices that gave people comfort and social position, required admitting that hierarchies were invented fictions rather than natural laws. "What kind of operations are you proposing?" Göring asked, though he already knew he wouldn't like the answer. Kaltenbrunner opened a leather folder and extracted typed documents. "Several options exist on a spectrum from harassment to elimination. Option 1, sabotage of fuel supplies through chemical contamination, would render aircraft inoperable without obvious cause, creates maintenance delays and operational uncertainty. Low risk, moderate impact." Göring nodded reluctantly. Fuel contamination at least maintained some pretense of targeting equipment rather than humans. Option 2, direct attacks on ground facilities using partisan cover, small arms fire, mortar attacks on maintenance hangars and pilot quarters. Higher risk, but creates casualties and forces pilots to focus on ground security rather than mission preparation. Significant psychological impact. The room felt colder. They were discussing terrorizing American soldiers in their own bases, far from any combat zone. And option 3? Göring asked, though part of him didn't want to know. Kaltenbrunner's smile widened into something that would haunt Göring's nightmares. Targeted operations against individual pilots, accidents during off-duty hours, vehicle malfunctions, contaminated rations, deaths that appear random or attributable to normal wartime hazards. Eliminates experienced pilots permanently. Forces Americans to replace them with less capable aviators. Cumulative effect over months could degrade unit effectiveness by 40 to 60%. The room fell into horrified silence. Göring had fought in World War I, had seen the worst conventional warfare offered. But there existed an unspoken code among military aviators. You fought in the sky according to rules that preserved some scrap of honor. What Kaltenbrunner was proposing was murder disguised as accidents, assassination of enemy pilots outside combat operations. This crosses ethical boundaries, Göring said carefully. Even in total war there are lines. Ethics are luxuries for nations that can afford them, Kaltenbrunner replied with the flat affect of a sociopath. Germany is fighting for survival. The Führer has identified the 332nd as an ideological threat that undermines our foundational principles at a critical moment in the war. Eliminating that threat through unconventional means isn't ethical failure. It's strategic necessity. Göring wanted to argue, wanted to reject the entire proposal and walk out of the briefing room. But he'd seen what happened to officers who defied Hitler's explicit orders. The concentration camps weren't reserved exclusively for Jews and political prisoners anymore. Anyone deemed defeatist or insufficiently committed to total war could find themselves on trains heading east to places they'd never return from. I'll present these options to the Führer, Göring said, gathering the documents like they were contaminated. Final authorization must come from him directly. Of course, Kaltenbrunner agreed smoothly, though I suspect we both know which option he'll choose. The prediction proved accurate. When Göring briefed Hitler on the 3 options, the Führer selected option 2, direct attacks on ground facilities, with explicit authorization for escalation to option 3 if opportunities presented themselves. Hitler wanted the 392nd to feel hunted, to experience the same psychological pressure they'd been inflicting on German forces through their exceptional performance. To understand that being black in a white man's war made them targets beyond normal military rules. Orders went out through encrypted channels to SS operatives in Italy. Plans were drawn for attacks on Ramatelli airfield, timed to coincide with major bombing operations to force the Americans to divide attention between aerial combat and ground security. It was asymmetric warfare at its most ruthless, driven not by military necessity, but by one man's inability to reconcile observable reality with ideological certainty. Meanwhile, at Ramatelli airfield, Captain Wilson and his fellow pilots prepared for their next missions, unaware that the war had expanded beyond aerial combat into something darker and more personal. They focused on flight training, aircraft maintenance, mission briefings, the normal rhythm of military aviation. They didn't know they'd become targets of an obsession that extended from Hitler's bunker to SS planning rooms, to operatives moving through Italian countryside with weapons and explosives. The Shadow War was beginning, and nobody on the American side recognized the danger until it was too late. The explosion occurred at 3:47 in the morning on March 8, 1944. Captain Wilson was jolted from sleep by a concussive blast that rattled his bunk and blew out windows in the pilot quarters. He rolled to the floor instinctively, heart hammering, reaching for the pistol he kept holstered on his bedpost. Outside, orange flames climbed into the pre-dawn sky from the maintenance hangar. Secondary explosions followed as fuel drums ignited in chain reaction, ammunition cooking off in the heat, with the distinctive crack of ordnance detonating under thermal stress. Wilson pulled on boots and ran toward the flight line with dozens of other pilots and ground crew, all of them moving toward the fire despite every survival instinct screaming to run the opposite direction. The maintenance hangar was a total loss. 3 P-51 Mustangs inside had been destroyed, their aluminum airframes melting into abstract sculptures in 2,000-degree heat. Worse was the human cost. 2 mechanics who'd been working night shift on engine repairs were dead. Their bodies recovered from the wreckage after fires were finally contained at dawn. Colonel Davis ordered a full investigation. Military police cordoned off the area, collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, photographing the scene. The official determination came back within hours. Accidental explosion caused by fuel vapor ignition. Tragic, but not unprecedented. These things happened in wartime operations where exhausted crews worked with volatile materials under constant pressure. But Wilson didn't believe it. Neither did most of the other pilots. The maintenance hangar had operated for 9 months without incident. The crew chiefs were experienced, careful men who understood fuel safety procedures intimately. And the timing was suspicious, occurring just hours before a scheduled maximum effort mission to Munich that would have deployed every available aircraft. "Someone got inside our perimeter," Wilson told Davis during a private meeting in the colonel's office. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate sabotage. Davis studied the MP investigation report, his expression unreadable. The evidence doesn't support that conclusion. No signs of forced entry, no unexploded ordnance, no witnesses reporting suspicious activity. Because whoever did this knew what they were doing, Wilson insisted. Professional operation, not amateur partisan activity. Sir, we both know the Germans have been obsessed with this unit. We've seen the tactical adaptations, the concentrated forces. This is escalation, taking the fight to us on the ground because they can't beat us in the air. Even if you're right, Davis replied carefully. What do you propose? We can't prove German involvement. Theater Command won't authorize retaliation based on speculation. And going public with accusations means explaining why the Germans might target us specifically, which means discussing race in official channels. That's a conversation nobody in the chain of command wants to have. Wilson sat back, frustrated by the impossible position. They were being targeted because of who they were, but acknowledging that targeting meant acknowledging the racial dynamics everyone pretended didn't exist. The conspiracy of silence protected the Germans more effectively than any defensive perimeter. Over the following weeks, additional incidents occurred with disturbing regularity. A fuel truck's brake lines failed, sending it careening into a parked aircraft. Contaminated rations sickened 12 pilots with food poisoning severe enough to ground them for a week. Small arms fire from nearby hills peppered the airfield during evening hours, forcing pilots to sprint between buildings like they were under combat conditions. Each incident was individually explainable as accident or random partisan harassment, but collectively, they formed an unmistakable pattern of systematic degradation designed to reduce operational effectiveness through death by 1,000 cuts. The 302nd's mission-ready aircraft count dropped from 43 to 31. Pilot fatigue increased from constant security alerts and interrupted sleep. Ground crew morale deteriorated as mechanics worked overtime repairing sabotage damage disguised as mechanical failures. The psychological impact was exactly what Hitler had intended. Pilots who should have been focused on aerial tactics spent mental energy watching for infiltrators. Maintenance crews inspected aircraft with paranoid thoroughness, adding hours to routine procedures. The unit's effectiveness declined, not because the Germans had beaten them in combat, but because they'd introduced uncertainty and dread that sapped energy and attention. Wilson noticed the change in his own performance. During missions, part of his mind remained at Ramitelli, worrying about what might be happening while he was away. The mental split degraded his tactical decision-making in subtle but measurable ways. His gunnery accuracy dropped 3%. His reaction time to radio calls increased by fractions of seconds, small degradations. But in aerial combat where margins determined survival, even small degradations mattered enormously. Then, on April 3, 1944, everything changed in the worst possible way. Lieutenant Samuel Harris didn't return from a mission over Vienna. His aircraft was last seen breaking from formation after taking flak damage, heading south toward Allied lines at reduced altitude. Search efforts found no trace of wreckage, no parachute, no emergency beacon signal. 3 days later, Italian partisans found Harris's body in a field 20 miles from Ramitelli. He had successfully bailed out from his damaged aircraft and parachuted safely to the ground. The cause of death wasn't flak wounds or crash injuries. It was 3 gunshot wounds to the back of the head at close range, execution-style murder after capture. The partisans also found a note pinned to Harris's flight suit. The message was typed in German, translated later by intelligence officers. "This is what happens to inferior races who dare to challenge Aryan supremacy. More will follow unless the colored American pilots are withdrawn from combat operations. This is your only warning." The note found on Lieutenant Harris's body detonated like a grenade through American military intelligence offices. For 18 months, the American command structure had maintained careful silence about the 382nd Fighter Group's racial composition, treating them like any other unit in official communications. The German note obliterated that fiction with 3 typed paragraphs of explicit racial threat that couldn't be ignored or explained away. Colonel Davis was summoned to headquarters in Naples to brief General Ira Eaker, commander of Mediterranean Allied Air Forces. The meeting room held more brass than Davis typically encountered in one place. Generals, colonels, intelligence officers, political advisors who'd arrived from Washington on emergency flights. Everyone needed to understand what was happening and decide how to respond to a situation that had no good options. "The Germans have taken this beyond military operations," Davis explained, standing before the assembled officers. "Lieutenant Harris was executed after capture specifically because of his race. The note makes that explicit. We are not facing conventional enemy actions anymore. We are facing war crimes motivated by ideology, committed outside the normal rules of warfare." General Eaker studied the translated note, his weathered face grim. "This creates impossible complications politically. If we publicize this execution, we acknowledge the racial targeting, which means discussing segregation in American forces. Congress will hold hearings. Civil rights groups will demand immediate integration. Southern senators will fight to maintain current policies. We'll spend more energy fighting political battles at home than fighting Germans in Europe." "With respect, General," Davis replied, his voice carefully controlled. "Lieutenant Harris is dead. 2 more of my pilots are missing after recent missions. My mechanics have been killed in sabotage attacks disguised as accidents. At what point does protecting the domestic political situation become less important than protecting American servicemen from documented war crimes?" The room fell into uncomfortable silence. Everyone understood Davis's argument was morally unassailable, but politically impossible to act on. A political advisor from the State Department spoke up. "If we go public with accusations of racial war crimes, it gives Germany ammunition for propaganda. They'll immediately point to American lynchings, Jim Crow laws, race riots. They'll argue, quite effectively, that America has no moral authority to condemn Germany's racial policies when our own discriminatory practices are well documented and ongoing." "So we do nothing?" Davis asked, his frustration finally breaking through his professional composure. "We let German intelligence murder American pilots because acknowledging the murders is politically inconvenient for both sides?" General Eaker raised his hand. "Nobody's suggesting we do nothing, Colonel. We're trying to find a response that protects your pilots without creating a propaganda disaster that damages the Allied cause. Those objectives are not mutually exclusive." Over the following hours, the assembled officers debated various options. Some argued for quiet diplomatic pressure through neutral intermediaries. Others suggested military retaliation, targeted operations against German intelligence facilities, tit-for-tat escalation that stayed below public visibility. Davis listened to the discussions with growing frustration. Everyone focused obsessively on managing political fallout and propaganda implications, while his pilots continued flying missions with targets painted on their backs. The institutionalized racism that had created segregated military units was now actively endangering lives, and the same institutional structures prevented addressing that danger directly. Finally, Davis stood and interrupted a theoretical discussion about Red Cross involvement. Gentlemen, while we debate diplomatic protocols, my pilots face an enemy trying to kill them both in the air and on the ground. I need concrete action, not political strategy sessions. Eaker nodded decisively. You're right, Colonel. Here's what happens immediately. First, I'm authorizing dedicated counterintelligence resources for your unit. Experienced OSS operatives who specialize in infiltration detection and partisan network disruption. Second, we establish a rapid response force of military police specifically assigned to Ramatelli security. Third, we rotate your unit's operational base periodically to prevent Germans from establishing surveillance patterns. What about retaliation for Lieutenant Harris? Davis asked directly. Officially, we can't acknowledge race-based targeting without political authorization from Washington. That won't come, Eaker replied. Unofficially. He glanced at the intelligence officers present. Efforts will be made to identify and neutralize the German intelligence networks operating in southern Italy. Some of those efforts might be considerably more aggressive than standard counterintelligence operations. Is that sufficient? Davis understood the subtext clearly. The American military would respond to German war crimes through covert operations that maintained plausible deniability. It wasn't justice, but it was something. Thank you, General. My pilots will continue their mission. I know they will, Eaker replied. And Colonel, for what it's worth, the performance of the 332nd has not gone unnoticed at the highest levels. General Eisenhower specifically mentioned your unit in recent briefings, praising your bomber protection statistics. There are conversations happening about integration, about changing policies after the war ends. What you and your pilots are accomplishing has impact beyond the immediate military situation. Davis nodded but felt no satisfaction. Change after the war wouldn't help Lieutenant Harris or the other pilots targeted by German obsession right now. They needed protection immediately, not promises about future policy reforms that might never materialize. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally, its armies defeated, its cities in ruins, its Führer dead by suicide in a Berlin bunker, while Soviet shells reduced the capital to rubble. The 1,000-year Reich Hitler had promised lasted exactly 12 years and left Europe in ashes. Captain Robert Wilson stood on the tarmac at Ramatelli on VE Day, watching mechanics paint final victory symbols on the red-tailed Mustangs that had carried them through 2 years of combat. The 332nd Fighter Group had completed 200 bomber escort missions. They had damaged or destroyed 409 German aircraft, and they had maintained the most exceptional bomber protection record of any escort group in the entire war, flying 179 missions, where not a single bomber under their direct protection was lost to enemy fighters. The statistics were undeniable. The record was verified by multiple sources and confirmed through exhaustive documentation that nobody could dispute. Black American pilots had not merely performed adequately. They had excelled beyond standards achieved by any comparable unit, white or black, American or Allied. But VE Day celebrations felt muted for Wilson and his fellow pilots. They'd won the war against Germany, but they were returning to an America where segregation remained legal, where Jim Crow laws denied them basic civil rights, where the same nation they'd fought to protect still refused them service at restaurants and hotels because of skin color. Colonel Davis gathered his pilots for a final briefing as the unit prepared to redeploy stateside. What we accomplished here will echo for generations, Davis said, his voice carrying across the assembled pilots. We proved something that racists claimed was impossible. We demonstrated excellence under circumstances specifically designed to ensure our failure. And we did it with honor, discipline, and courage that nobody can honestly dispute. Will it matter? Lieutenant Bailey asked quietly. Will anything actually change back home because we shot down German planes over Europe? Davis was silent for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. I don't know with certainty, he admitted. Real change comes slowly, painfully. But we've given people who advocate for justice undeniable evidence. We've made it impossible for anyone to claim with a straight face that Black Americans can't perform at the highest levels, in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. That's not nothing. That's ammunition for battles that will be fought long after we're gone. Wilson thought about Lieutenant Harris, executed by German infiltrators for having the audacity to challenge Nazi racial theories by existing as an excellent pilot. Thought about the mechanics killed in sabotage attacks. Thought about pilots lost to war crimes that operated outside conventional combat. He thought about Hitler obsessing over reconnaissance photographs in his bunker, unable to reconcile observable reality with ideological certainty, unable to accept that his racial theories were fiction exposed by facts. The victory felt incomplete because the war had revealed truths many people still weren't ready to accept. Germany had built an empire on racial hierarchy and been utterly defeated by a coalition that included soldiers from dozens of ethnicities and backgrounds working together. The Tuskegee Airmen had demonstrated through undeniable performance that capability transcended racial categories completely. But acknowledging those truths required surrendering prejudices that gave people comfort and social position. Required admitting that hierarchies were invented fictions rather than natural laws. What happened to Hitler in the end? Wilson asked. Did we ever get confirmation about his final response to us? Davis nodded slowly. Intelligence recovered documents from the Reich Chancellery before Soviet forces completely occupied Berlin. Apparently, Hitler spent his final weeks obsessing over Luftwaffe combat reports. One of his last recorded statements to Bormann included specific references to what he called the Negro fighter problem and how it represented the ultimate betrayal by reality itself. The phrase hung in the air like an indictment, betrayal by reality itself. It captured something essential about Hitler's psychology, and by extension, the psychology of anyone who built their entire worldview on racial hierarchy. When evidence contradicted their beliefs, they didn't change the beliefs to match evidence. They claimed the evidence was lying. They attacked reality itself for refusing to conform to their prejudices. As the 332nd prepared to leave Italy, Wilson reflected on what they'd accomplished beyond the impressive military statistics. They'd forced an entire ideology to confront its own falseness in ways that couldn't be denied or explained away. They demonstrated truths about human capability that no amount of propaganda could suppress. They'd won battles in the air and fought a shadow war on the ground, all while representing something vastly larger than themselves or any individual mission. The journey home would be complicated. They'd return as decorated combat veterans who had served their country with distinction, only to face a nation that still denied them equal rights under law. But they'd also return with evidence nobody could honestly dismiss. Combat records, verified mission reports, documented success that established new standards for excellence in military aviation. Years later, historians would study the Tuskegee Airmen's record and recognize its significance extended far beyond military achievement. The 332nd Fighter Group had participated in a larger battle about human potential and the lies people told themselves about racial hierarchy. Their success didn't immediately change American society, but it provided intellectual and moral ammunition for civil rights advocates who would fight those battles in courts, legislatures, and streets across America for decades. Hitler's response to their success, the obsession, the war crimes, the desperate attempts to destroy them through unconventional means, revealed the fragility of ideology based on false premises. When reality contradicted Nazi racial theory, Hitler couldn't adapt the theory to accommodate reality. He could only double down on the lies and try to eliminate the evidence that exposed them as fiction. The Tuskegee Airmen flew home carrying knowledge that would shape their lives forever. They'd seen the worst of what racial hatred could produce when given state power. Concentration camps liberated by Allied forces, victims of industrialized genocide, smoking ruins of cities destroyed in service of ideology. They'd fought against that evil and won decisively. But they'd also learned that prejudice wasn't confined to enemy nations or defeated regimes. It existed everywhere in different forms and intensities. The fight for equality would continue long after this war ended, fought on different battlefields against different enemies using different weapons. As Wilson's transport aircraft lifted off from Italian soil for the final time, he looked down at Ramitelli Airfield growing smaller beneath the wings. 2 years of his life had been spent at that base, fighting multiple wars simultaneously. The war against Germany and the war against everyone who said black men couldn't fly, couldn't fight, couldn't excel. He'd lost friends, survived assassination attempts, participated in one of history's most significant demonstrations that human capability transcends the artificial categories prejudice invents. The victory was real but incomplete. The war had ended, but the larger struggle for recognition of fundamental human equality would continue for generations. The Tuskegee Airmen had won their battles decisively, but the war against prejudice required continued fighting long after the guns fell silent. Still, as Wilson watched Italy disappear beneath clouds, he felt something approaching genuine satisfaction. They'd done what they set out to do: prove excellence under impossible circumstances, maintain honor despite facing enemies who fought without it, establish a record that nobody could honestly dismiss or diminish. Hitler had tried to destroy them because their existence contradicted his ideology at its very foundation. He'd failed completely. They'd survived, excelled, and left evidence that would outlive the Reich by centuries. In the end, reality had betrayed Hitler's worldview, because his worldview was built entirely on lies. The Tuskegee Airmen had simply existed as living proof those lies were false. That was victory enough. Thanks so much for sticking with this story to the end. If you found it as powerful as we did putting it together, we'd genuinely appreciate a like and subscribe. It helps us keep bringing these untold stories to light. And we're curious, what other hidden World War II stories do you think deserve to be told? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know where you're watching from. Are you a history teacher, a veteran, someone who just discovered this incredible story? We want to hear from you.